Welcome to the second webinar in this series entitled Challenges in Pediatric Neuroscience Research. My name is Adam Hartman. I'm a program director in the Division of Clinical Research at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, one of the institutes at the U.S. National Institutes of Health. I have a number of pediatric clinical trials and other human subjects studies in my portfolio. I also am a practicing child neurologist and epileptologist. We created this series to help investigators overcome some of the challenges that they might face in pediatric neuroscience. This includes neurology, neurosurgery, psychiatry, psychology, neurodevelopmental disabilities, physiatry, critical care, emergency medicine, pathology, radiology, and pharmacology, just to name a few, and there are many others. The ultimate goal is to improve the quality of care for our patients, but the more proximal goal is to enhance research that will facilitate improvements in practice. Some of our webinars will be targeted to trainees, some to senior investigators, and some to those who are not currently involved in research, making the pie bigger, so to speak. We will be discussing funding opportunities from nonprofit organizations and patient advocacy groups. I should mention that this is a follow-up presentation from our last webinar on how to get involved in research at any stage of your career. Our guests today are Drs. Laura Lubbers from Citizens United for Research in Epilepsy and Philip Yeske from the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation. First, a few technical notes about the webinar. This session is being recorded and will be transcribed and archived on the NINDS website. Details about where to find the archived version will be posted on social media and professional society listservs and newsletters. There will be a question and answer segment at the end. To ask a question of our presenters, you can either click on the ellipsis near the bottom of your screen and click on Q&A, or open the participant window and on the bottom right, find the Q&A area. To repeat, if you have questions for our presenters, please either click on the ellipsis near the bottom of your screen and click on Q&A, or open the participant window and on the bottom right, find the Q&A area. I will moderate the question period. Special thanks to Tim Leiden from NINDS for the technical support and coordination of the webinar, and the NINDS Office of the Scientific Liaison for all of its support and the publicity. As a side note, we are looking to hire a new program director in neurodevelopmental disabilities at NINDS. Please see the information here and contact email shown here, or me if you are interested. Okay, let's get started. Our first speaker is Dr. Laura Lubbers, the Chief Scientific Officer of Citizens United for Research in Epilepsy, or CURE. Dr. Lubbers received her Bachelor of Science in Physiology and Master's and PhD in Veterinary Biosciences, all from the University of Illinois at Urbana. Prior to joining CURE, she spent 15 years in a large pharmaceutical company as a drug discovery scientist. During that time, she led research projects and developed novel chemical entities to counter the effects of various neurological disorders. She expanded her expertise to other therapeutic areas with critical unmet medical needs such as oncology and infectious diseases. Importantly, Dr. Lubbers' sister suffers from intractable epilepsy. The impact of epilepsy on her sister and family inspired Dr. Lubbers to transition to CURE.
Hello, Adam and everyone. Thank you so much for having us speak today. Let me just share my screen and get this into full presentation mode. Slowly. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Again, thank you so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to talk both about the organization as well as the role of nonprofit funders in driving research in the greater research arena. As Adam already mentioned, I am the Chief Scientific Officer at CURE, and I've been with the organization for over 3 years now, and I came in with a background in neuroscience and spent 15 years working on various drug discovery projects. As Adam mentioned, my sister Ellen has epilepsy, and over my life, I've developed a real passion to improve the lives of those who suffer with epilepsy. Ellen started having seizures at the age of 3 months, and so I'm quite familiar with the challenges that people with epilepsy face, and that there's a need for better treatments for her and the 3.5 million people in the U.S. and approximately 65 million people in the world who struggle with epilepsy. And that's why I came to CURE, to find new treatments for those who suffer. Cure has been around in the greater research arena for over 20 years. And our mission is to find a cure for epilepsy through promoting and funding patient-focused research. We funded work worldwide and primarily fund individual investigators through a number of different funding mechanisms that I'll share more about. We also drive large consortium-style projects that bring together experts to dive deep into a specific topic, and I'll talk a little bit about those as different ways that we drive research. But the goal of all of our work is to drive meaningful advances towards cures for people with epilepsy. As I mentioned, we primarily fund research through investigator-initiated grants. We currently have 3 funding mechanisms that fund individual investigators, and for all of our grants, our key priority areas include acquired and pediatric epilepsies listed on the left, as well as treatment-resistant epilepsy, the interaction between sleep and epilepsy, and sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, or SUDEP. For all of these grant mechanisms, our grant applications must progress through both a letter of intent phase and a full proposal review by peers and members of our community who are touched by epilepsy. We feel that the patient voice is critical in helping us assess what the most appropriate research is to fund. Just want to briefly overview some of these different awards. The Catalyst Award, listed at the top of the slide, is our newest award, and it's intended to fund translational research that has a goal of advancing new therapies into clinical application. This award is up to $250,000 over 2 years, and actually our call for letters of intent for this award opens on Monday. We're very excited about this opening. We also have 2 other mechanisms. The Cure Epilepsy Award is open to established investigators, whereas the Taking Flight Award is focused on junior investigators with the goal of helping them indeed take flight in their careers and establish a career path that is independent from their mentors. This award requires the applicants to have at least 3 years of postdoctoral experience and funds up to $100,000 over the course of a year. The Cure Epilepsy Award, which is the second in the list, is a larger award, $250,000 over 2 years. The calls for both the Cure Epilepsy and Taking Flight awards will open later this year, and you can find more information on our website at www.cureepilepsy.org. There are many, many different details that we could go into, but I know that we have a limited amount of time to share information about our organization. So I just want to touch on some of the highlights over the course of our existence, starting with in the early 2000s when we started funding research on SUDEP. So as I mentioned, in addition to our cure at the very beginning of my talk, we fund investigator-initiated grants, but also do some deep dives into areas. And our SUDEP initiative was our first deep dive into trying to understand why people pass away when they have epilepsy. What are the biological underpinnings that cause somebody to die? And this was a topic that, as a field, we did not talk about even in the early 2000s. And so this was really seminal in driving both the discussion and also some of the research related to SUDEP. As part of this, Cure funded a SUDEP registry, one of the first of its kind, and also studies that led to a better understanding of risk factors for SUDEP. This was a productive endeavor for us, and so we continued to drive research through this different form, this different mechanism of funding. And in 2013, we started a new initiative called the Infantile Spasms Initiative. And this also took a new approach of funding research by employing a team science approach to the research. This project brought together teams of teams with different expertise to really dig deep into the issue of infantile spasms, which is a catastrophic form of pediatric epilepsy. We are also keen to identify key research gaps in gaps in our understanding. And one of the gaps that we identified in the earlier in this decade was a gap in understanding of genetics. And so we launched a separate initiative focused on epilepsy genetics called the EGI, or Epilepsy Genetics Initiative. And the goal was to help identify new diagnoses for patients and also to spur more research on the genetics underlying epilepsy. So this, again, was another large project that engaged clinical sites around the world, bringing data into a hub site at Columbia University to drive new discovery and make these data available through other sources, including the NIH. And finally, I want to just touch on our current large-scale effort, which is focused on post-traumatic epilepsy in combination with the Department of Defense. Again, like the Infantile Spasms Initiative, this effort brings together teams of teams across the globe to study the issue of post-traumatic epilepsy and drive advances in real time. So these investigators are interacting in a real-time basis to share information, help think about the outcomes of studies, and then drive new directions. So this just gives you another example of how nonprofit funders can become engaged and dig deep into a particular area of study to help move the science along more quickly. We also play very important roles in other ways too, especially when it comes to education. Education for our researchers, but also our larger epilepsy community. And we do this through a variety of ways. We have a regular webinar series that brings together leaders in various aspects of epilepsy to talk about specific topics. Most recently, we had a topic, we discussed epilepsy and autism. We've also discussed epilepsy learning healthcare systems just earlier this month, with more topics to come. We also have regular online communications through sharing key discoveries that come out of our grants, but also what's happening in the greater community. I think people are very much inspired by all of the work that is happening across our research arena. The patient families really appreciate knowing that somebody cares and somebody's working on this, and we're going to come and move the science forward. We also fund conferences, basic and translational scientific conferences, family advocacy research conferences, clinical conferences. We host university seminars. So if somebody wants to host a seminar and their department doesn't have the money, they can apply to us and we can provide the funding. And then we also play a key role in research advocacy. I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but we are very appreciative of the interaction that we have with groups like NINDS that really care about the patient voice and in making sure that the work that's being funded across the research arena is applicable to the patient community. So these are just some of the high-level ways I wanted to share that, that nonprofit funders get engaged with research and also interact more broadly across the community. So I think with that, I will hand it over to Phil.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Lovers. And while you're transitioning, I will introduce our next speaker, Dr. Philip Yeske, who is the Science and Alliance Officer of the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation. Dr. Yeske received his bachelor's in science and chemistry from Allegheny College in 1985 and a doctorate in organic chemistry from Emory University in 1990. After a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Pittsburgh, Dr. Yeske joined the Bayer Corporation. There he held positions progressing from basic research to global account management over a 10-year period, including a 4-year assignment at Bayer's corporate headquarters in Leverkusen, Germany. From 2001 to 2013, he served as president and chief executive officer of the life sciences technology company Floris Technologies Incorporated before co-founding MS2 Array LLC, a drug discovery company. Dr. Yeske has been active in the mitochondrial disease community for nearly 15 years, first as a parent of an affected child, then later as trustee of the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation. Dr. Yeske.
Thanks, Adam, for that very kind introduction, and again for the invitation to present here today and be part of this webinar. For those of you not familiar with mitochondrial disease, UMDF represents inherited forms of mitochondrial disease, has a prevalence of roughly 1 in 5,000, meaning in the United States there should be around 70,000 patients, and globally more than 1 million. We know that that number are not diagnosed, though, and characterized because it's a very challenging diagnosis. It's extremely heterogeneous. Over 350 different genetic mutations have been identified that cause primary mitochondrial disease across 2 genomes, both nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA. So because of this, the diagnosis can be challenging, because phenotypically it's a wide range of symptoms. It can range from pediatric patients with neurological symptoms that may ultimately be fatal to adults, mature adults with mild muscle-related symptoms that may just be a quality of life issue for them and otherwise normal life. So because of this, it's very hard to move forward with finding treatments and cures for mitochondrial disease, but that is at the heart of our mission and why the UMDF is here. Today I'm going to talk about all aspects of the mission of the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation with a focus on the research portfolio for which I'm responsible. So other than research, education, advocacy, and support are primary silos of the mission of the UMDF. Let me just talk briefly about each one of those. From an education perspective, one of the hallmarks of the UMDF mission is our annual Mitochondrial Medicine Symposium. Unfortunately, unable to have that in person this year because of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, we are offering a virtual version of the symposium, a one-day event on Friday, June 26th. I encourage you to visit our website, umdf.org, to find out more about that. We're going to focus on clinical trials and lessons learned from clinical trials conducted in mitochondrial disease to date, and then how we can conduct those clinical trials better in the future to give us a better chance of developing therapeutics. There are currently no approved therapeutics for mitochondrial disease, so there's a very large unmet medical need. Otherwise, for education, we try to bring seminars and meetings to patients around the country to ensure that they're well educated about the disease, but also for clinicians in grand rounds to learn more about the disease, diagnosis, and care of mitochondrial disease patients. We also house a very large repository of online resources. We are in the process of relaunching our website to have even more capability for educating through online resources. So we hope to be able to share with you soon news about the creation of MitoU, an online opportunity to broadly learn about mitochondrial disease. From a support perspective, we again try to utilize peer-to-peer support as much as possible. Others that are experiencing life with mitochondrial disease are in the best position to help others that are going through that process and at the various stages of the journey. So we utilize ambassadors across the country to support us in that regard. We also provide online communities, Facebook and others, to ensure there's a place for robust yet private discussion about life with mitochondrial disease. And then from within UMDF, we offer a number of concierge services where we're connecting the dots between patients in search of a mitochondrial disease expert and a clinician that has such skill sets. From an advocacy point of view, we're very proud that last year, 2019, we hosted an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting in partnership with the FDA. This was really an important milestone for our community in capturing the voice of the patient. making sure that we could understand the needs, the desires, the wants within the context of living with mitochondrial disease, and how to improve it through development of therapeutics. Beyond that, we have a very active mitochondrial disease congressional caucus that is noted at the bottom of the slide, 32 members and growing constantly, where we're raising awareness of mitochondrial disease at the legislative level through regular briefings. I think perhaps most importantly, and what we're proudest of captured on this slide, is the over $140 million of follow-on funding that's come from the seed funding that UMDF has provided through various funding mechanisms. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in a second, but this is really the critical part of the mission, that we know we have some limited capacity, as most nonprofits do, to directly invest, but if our seed investments can bring follow-on investments, that's leveraging, and that's a powerful way to grow the amount of research that's taking place inside of a disease community. So let's take a couple of minutes and I'll talk about our research and scientific portfolio within the UMDF. We are an active grant maker. In the last fiscal year, we awarded $475,000 worth of grants. We are in the process of finalizing our 2020 grant cycle right now. The submission deadline has passed, but we're expecting to be right back and doing the same thing for fiscal year 21 next January. We should be announcing our awards soon in early June for fiscal year 20. Again, very proud of the fact that outside of the government and the NIH and the DoD have been very active supporters of mitochondrial research. UMDF is the largest non-governmental funder. We've directly invested $13 million into mitochondrial disease research. And on the previous slide, we know that that $13 million brought another $140 million of investment in mitochondrial disease research. And overall, our activities beyond grants totals up to about $1 million a year worth of scientific activity. And that's spread across a number of programs. And again, I'll get on to that next slide. One of those is the Mitochondrial Disease Community Registry, a patient-populated registry. So let's talk about mission delivery for UMDF from a science research perspective. Advancing scientific discovery is where we capture everything grant-related. Our competitive research prizes, the grant cycle that I just spoke to that is now closed and awards will be announced soon, is meant to cover all career stages from postdoctoral fellows through early stage investigators to experienced investigators, and is topic agnostic, meaning we're just looking for the best science. It could be basic science, translational science, could be clinical research, but we most of all want to fund the best science no matter where it's taking place in the world. That program is on an annual cycle and typically opens in January with the issuance of an RFP and closes in March with awards announced in June so that we can conduct appropriate peer review. Another type of funding that we've begun in the last couple of years are patient-led competitive grants. This we do in collaboration with other patient groups around the world interested in mitochondrial disease. We've pooled our funds. And this affords the opportunity to fund in a more targeted way. So whereas the competitive research prizes are topic agnostic, this one would be very specific. For example, we have a Lee syndrome roadmap competitive grant cycle that we offered last year. Lee syndrome is the most common form of pediatric mitochondrial disease. And this affords the opportunity to drill down and address very specific gaps associated with that subpopulation of the overall mitochondrial disease population. We also have family research funds and issue grants from that. So this you could consider analogous to crowdfunding, where we allow families to establish funds at UMDF and fundraise aggressively around a very focused topic. For instance, a very specific gene that may be pathological and cause mitochondrial disease. When they reach a certain financial threshold, we then will issue a very focused RFP and solicit grant proposals around that. Timing for these is variable, just depending on when those funds reach the financial threshold, but we try to be active with that consistently on an annual basis. And the newest version of our funding are called Strategic Opportunities Fund, and those are for topics and opportunities that don't fit within a traditional grant program. And here we open this up to proposals where we'll consider on a case-by-case basis the potential impact and the worthiness of that opportunity. So it's just a way to kind of round out and say not everything fits into a traditional basic translational clinical research project. Here's another pool of dollars available to support those things, also available. I think most importantly for those of you on today, if you don't currently receive communications from UMDF and would like to know about any or all of these funding mechanisms, please send an email to grants@umdf.org. and we'll happily put you on our distribution list. So beyond grants, and part of that $1 million total budget annual are our investments in infrastructure. This is really biomedical research infrastructure, recognizing that you need clinical data derived from doctors that are seeing patients on a regular basis. And we're very fortunate to have the NIH-funded North American Mitochondrial Disease Consortium, of which the NINDS is a lead institute. But we also have patient-populated data through our Mitochondrial Disease Community Registry. And this provides the complementary information of the patient perspective along with the clinical health data. But there's also a need for genomic data, and the MCTR project is a method or methodology for bringing genomic data together and then readily analyzing it, looking for pathological genes, but also comparing phenotypic data. And then in addition, we are building out a robust biorepository system so that this combination of genetic data, biorepository, clinical data, patient perspective really is that robust ecosystem you need to advance research towards treatments and cures for mitochondrial disease. So UMDF invests in all of these projects on an annual basis. The earliest stage project that we're working on now is a clinical trial network. And this is a very natural evolution as our community now advances from basic translational to more frequent clinical trials. This is a project that will bring the investigators together under one project stewarded by UMDF and allow industry or investigators that are interested in conducting clinical trials to have a point contact where that domain expertise around clinical trial resides. So we're very excited, and I'm sure we'll be talking more about that in the coming years. And then lastly, optimizing patient care. Certainly not least, there's the recognition that we have patients, again, at all stages of life, young, old, mildly affected, severely affected. We must constantly strive to optimize their clinical care. In this regard, we've partnered with the Mitochondrial Medicine Society to form a mitochondrial care network. And this is a set of sites around the United States where there is expertise in taking care of mitochondrial disease patients. And our hope here is that through a robust network, best practices can be readily shared, and we can slowly continue to raise the bar on what patient care looks like from a standard of care for mitochondrial disease patients. In conclusion, if I had to try to put one word to what we're doing, it's become the trusted partner, the central steward of research in the mitochondrial disease space. And we've built that up through relationships over now 24 years. Next year is our 25th anniversary. And it's by bringing the patients, the families, the researchers, the clinicians, and now ever more increasingly industry to the table to exchange the right information with the right people at the right time. And so this is at the core of UMDF, that we want to remain that trusted partner for all those stakeholders in the mitochondrial disease community. I'll end there and look forward to the discussion later. Thank you.
The next thing that we were going to do was listen to a fireside chat between our presenters, which is going to highlight a number of important points. And then again, we're going to have the Q&A session after that. We're going to talk about general goals of disease-related patient advocacy groups in the funding process, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, just sharing how we as nonprofit funders fit into this larger ecosystem, and we'll keep an eye to see if Phil joins us. But just to try to delineate for people how the different funding mechanisms work. We've already shared some overviews of our different funding mechanisms. And our goals generally as nonprofit funders are to fund somewhat smaller projects, because this is all driven by philanthropy. We've got to be very careful with the dollars that we do that are donated to us. So we tend to fund smaller projects compared to something like the NIH. And we often require them to have some preliminary data, but not often as much as might be required by the NIH. And our goal is often to support more high-risk, high-reward areas that, if funded, might stimulate new thinking and new ideas. And taking some risks might help open up the field of study that would benefit the patient community that we serve. And so one example, again, is our post-traumatic epilepsy initiative, where we've been given some funding from the Department of Defense to start to dig deeper into the animal models that are needed to really expand this field. Now, this isn't work that would traditionally be funded by the NIH, but because we're managing it, we can take a look at where those gaps in the environment are, in the research community are, receive applications that are sort of in this line, and fund, of course, the best science. As Phil mentioned, we always want to fund the best science. But we also can ask for other things. For example, we can ask for our researchers to institute use of common data elements. This is not widespread in the community, but certainly for our projects, we can ask for that. And for certainly like developing new animal models, really understanding what data are being collected, what units of measure are important, and then making sure that that's transparent to the broader community that will then come on board, hopefully, and help expand these models is part of the goal. So that's where we can do things a little differently compared to a larger governmental funding agency, ask some different kinds of questions, and also have some different requirements for researchers as part of these projects. We also can, again, seed new areas. We understood that there was a gap when it came to epilepsy genetics. It was an area that was starting to really grow, but what we could see in our patient community is that so many people, while they were very enthusiastic about getting tested for a potential genetic diagnosis, many people were coming back with no return of results from their genetic report. And we heard the cry from the community that we still need to come up with creative ways to try to move this forward. And so we thought about, genetic data are stable. What's changing is our understanding of the genetics. And so as we grow our understanding, we should continue to interrogate the data that exists. So we developed this whole program and pipeline to continue to interrogate data and get information back to patient families that they can use that for any variety of reasons. And including, family planning, potential use in treatment plans, and the list goes on. But then also to use those data for research. So those data have actually been deposited into the NIH DB gap, and they can be used for researchers. So there are all of these different ways that we can play a role in aiding both the patient community and the research community.
Great. Are there other mechanisms for seeding, like Shark Tank types of competitions or things like that that might help give you an idea of what, number one, how investigators can sort of gain your attention as well
Absolutely.
as see what's going on?
Absolutely. That's sort of the fun of being in the nonprofit space, is that you can come up with really creative ways to fund research. And while some of our mechanisms are pretty standard, very similar to NIH, where there's a letter of intent and a full proposal phase, and it goes through a standard review process, there are also other opportunities in the nonprofit environment that can help researchers. And one example that I always love to highlight, because it's just a lot of fun, is the Epilepsy Foundation Shark Tank, where people present proposals and they are evaluated by researchers, but then they are actually voted on during a conference. And the investigator has to give a pitch in front of the audience. Often they bring videos and they share the value of the science, and then the audience, mostly scientists and patients in that audience, are voting on what should be funded. And so it's a different way of approaching the funding. It's fun. It's very impactful because you're hearing from the scientist. All of the different stakeholders are engaging, and you're trying again to drive forward the science that's going to make a difference for all of those in the room, if you will. So those are a lot of fun. I know Phil had some really neat examples. It'd be great to get him back on the phone, because his organization has come up with other ways to connect, especially the younger investigators, with the donors. The donors are incredibly passionate about the work that needs to be done. They understand the critical need, and they've found ways to interact, to bring the postdocs together with the donors to really share that experience. And CURE does that to some degree. We know it's really powerful. It really inspires our researchers to do the best job they can with the science that they're funded to do. And there's a great synergy that happens in that environment. So that is the fun, creative, challenging, sometimes heartbreaking part of what we do, to hear the story, see the need, but then try to solve it.
So we're picking up, Phil, on I think you're going to be talking about some of the postdoctoral fellowships. We're doing the fireside section, some of the postdoc fellowships that you were talk about.
Yeah, with respect to sort of novel funding mechanisms, as Laura described, we launched last year the Accelerators program, which weds donor engagement with funding early stage professionals, in this case, postdoctoral fellows. And our thought was we routinely receive more fundable applications than we can possibly fund. That's the nature of it. And so when it comes time to perhaps picking one, we know we're leaving behind several others that have been judged meritorious by scientific peer review. So our thought was, why not let the patient community have a say in which of those meritorious grants should be, or proposals should be awarded. So the idea is, instead of just presenting one prize, we put forward 2 or 3 fundable projects from a scientific perspective in front of a group of donors, have the postdoctoral fellows pitch their idea. So I think this is really good experience, right, for the postdoctoral fellows to learn how to talk to a lay community about highly technical topics. Pitch for 5 minutes, and then we allow the donors to vote for which one they like best. Now, we had a great outcome last year in that we had 3 excellent candidates. One was selected, and our donor community was so moved by the passion and effort that was put in by the other 2 candidates that we were able to privately raise the money to support all 3 of those candidates. This is the perfect outcome, right, for a patient advocacy group. We're planting more seeds and hopefully attracting more young investigators to stay in the mitochondrial disease space. So that's our Accelerators program.
You guys want to talk about patient registries?
Yeah, Phil, we skipped over the discussion around patient registries, but your organization has more experience with that than mine. Would love to share that experience.
Sure.
With the audience.
Well, again, I'm not sure where I dropped off. I briefly spoke to a registry strategy that is multi-pronged. It needs to be by definition. You need deep medical information derived from clinicians. And so with NAMDAC, our NIH-supported clinical research network, we know that that's being collected and that those patients are being followed in a longitudinal manner to really build the natural history and understand the progression of mitochondrial disease. But there's an important component of registries and of data that comes from patient-derived. And so the UMDF stewards the Mitochondrial Disease Community Registry, where we afford patients the opportunity to share their voice through surveys, through participating in studies. It helps to guide our research priorities by understanding the voice of the patient. What's most important to them? What are the symptoms that they're experiencing that are most important to them? What are outcome measures that are meaningful to them as we move towards more and more clinical trials in this space? So I think this really aligns well with the FDA's evolution with regards to patient-focused drug development. And so we really try to bring both of those perspectives, right, the patient perspective and the clinician perspective through health information together with our registries. Now we know we need other things too, right? You need a vast amount of genomic data for something as heterogeneous as mitochondrial disease. And we also need biosamples because there's so many different types of mitochondrial disease. So it's really the wedding of all of these things through a registry strategy that I think leads to the most effective biomedical research, especially for a rare disease community.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Laura, did you have a chance to kind of talk about and some of the aspects of your, I know we wanted to touch on novel approaches to research, and I talked about our accelerators program, but did you have a chance to talk about some of the things going on at Cure?
Yes, I was able to do that. I'm wondering if we can just spend a couple of minutes just talking about some of the interactions that we have with the greater community, particularly in NINDS. It's an area that I'm really excited about in the way that we can engage to drive the science. And I know.
Yeah, so I think for mitochondrial disease, the NINDS is the lead institutes on our clinical research network funded through the RDCRN. It's allowed us to cut horizontally across the various institutes of the NIH, the formation of a mito interest group, right, with representation from multiple institutes. For something like mitochondrial biology, mitochondrial research, it doesn't fit well within any one organ, right? All of our organs have mitochondria and depend on it for energy generation and many other functions. So we really need these mechanisms to be able to look across the institutes, and working closely with NINDS and the mito interest group, we've been able to accomplish that. But I know for you guys, right, in the epilepsy, you have some very specific programs, the research benchmarks, for instance, that really seem like a great example of how to make that work.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great endeavor. The epilepsy community came together almost 2 decades ago, or actually 2 decades ago, to help talk about what's needed for a cure. And we're able to establish what we call the research epilepsy benchmarks, which I think is really important for investigators to know about. And even if you're not in the epilepsy space, thinking about, what kind of guidance are you getting from your funding agency, and how do you align your research with those overarching goals? And again, for epilepsy, it's focused on the epilepsy research benchmarks, which are key priority areas that have been decided upon through incredible collaboration among stakeholders, including the researchers, clinicians, government agencies, and now the patient voice, to talk about what are the areas that we really need to fund. What areas do we really need to drive the research in order to make a difference for our community? So this is a process that is ongoing right now, but is something that over the last couple of decades gets refreshed, and it will culminate in a conference that was supposed to happen in April, but it's now going to be in January, where we all get together as a community and talk about what are the key areas. And new things are coming out. While we want to cure epilepsy, we are now appreciating epilepsy is much broader than just seizures. There are comorbidities. These need to be solved as a part of the overall complex or syndrome. And so we as community members can bring this forward, and researchers, clinicians are really, we're all embedded in this to figure out what are the next key steps that need to be done. And young researchers should be looking at those and thinking about how, where the field needs to go and how they can plug into that. And certainly a great way to align with funding.
Yeah, I think this is a really key point, right, from the discussion here. The patient community as equal partners in developing a research roadmap. Yeah, for a long time, that group was always a lagging stakeholder, if you will. Right? It was advanced by scientists, by clinicians, and then near the end, when they thought they had it all worked out and were ready to perhaps go to clinical trials, that's when the patients were asked to become involved. And if there's anything that's been learned and has really changed the landscape of research, it's the importance of engaging the patients, and oftentimes patient advocacy groups as proxies for the individual patients, early in the process, as early as possible, to find out what's most important to them, and then identify the gaps and form the research plan around that.
Right.
Great. So I'd like to make sure that we have enough time for Q&A. Thanks to both of you. That was a great discussion. One question that I've been getting is, what is the impact of COVID-19 on your foundations, both in terms of ongoing research, supporting ongoing research, and taking new applications?
Bill, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I can start there. So, again, we've been in contact with a lot of different patient advocacy groups, nonprofit organizations, throughout this COVID-19 pandemic, just to understand the impact of it. And without a doubt, it's had an impact from a fundraising point of view. Focus is elsewhere right now. That being said, I think for UNDF specifically, we're in a very good position to ride out this tumultuous time, continue to make consistent investments in research, and frankly, all aspects of our mission, all four silos. We will fund grants this year. We intend to fund grants next year. Although next year, just out of an abundance of caution, we'll probably take a wait-and-see attitude. We'll start with a limited budget, and if the year progresses and we're able to achieve the goals that we aim to achieve from a fundraising point of view, we'll increase the budget and make more awards. So we think it's important in the hardest of times to be consistent and there for the research community. But we also have to be good stewards of our donor dollars. And so our organization, like all other organizations at this time, for-profit and nonprofit, have to carefully watch line by line. But the bottom line for us is UMDF has been there, is here now, and will continue to be there going forward.
And I can just echo the same thing for CURE. Of course, fundraising has been impacted, and we're thinking about creative ways to engage our community to continue to, encourage them to donate for science. But we also continue to plan, of course, continue to fund the research that we have ongoing, and then moving forward with our grant cycles. We are actually opening, as I mentioned earlier, a call for new proposals on Monday, and then we plan to continue forward. And we'll see what next year is looking like, but with good management and stewardship of our dollars, we feel that we can continue to move forward without too many challenges.
The next question is if you could comment about how to approach funding work that is cross-disciplinary. So for one example is pediatric rehabilitation of acquired brain injury, particularly cognitive rehab. So it doesn't, that sort of thing doesn't quite fit into the cerebral palsy space, doesn't quite fit into the TBI space, but it sort of spans across a number of different disciplines.
That's a great question, and it's one that we struggle with too. I think through this benchmarks process, we're identifying some of those gaps where synergizing across areas is critical. One example is for epilepsy, for the comorbidities and the cognitive impact, the neurodevelopmental pieces of epilepsy, and bringing together the key groups at the government level to talk about those things. Those are things that are coming out of our current benchmarks discussion. Finding these gaps, I think, aligning key nonprofits to stimulate research in this area is a great suggestion. In some areas, we're doing that, not particularly this one, but certainly open to ideas and potential collaborations.
And Adam, if I could just comment briefly, I know that wasn't really directed to the mitochondrial disease space, but there are many similarities. We're focused on inherited forms of mitochondrial disease, but we know, and science has shown, that mitochondrial function is central to the human health condition. So here too, we have the opportunity to partner with many other disease groups looking at neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, metabolic diseases like diabetes. Ultimately, the disease that gets us all, aging, has a large component of healthy mitochondrial function, right, at its root. So there's that opportunity to learn from other disciplines, but also to share, right, with other disciplines. And I think well-organized patient groups can help make those connections across fences and silos that otherwise might make it difficult. So encourage investigators to look across and not specifically at one disease, but perhaps where the impact might be broader.
Great, thank you. One question that came in was, what role does crowdsourcing play for your foundations?
Laura, I don't know if you have anything you want to share.
Cure itself doesn't do crowdsourcing. However, again, I think it certainly happens in our community. The Shark Tank that I mentioned is a crowdsourcing approach, and I know that other groups have implemented crowdsourcing. For example, the TS Alliance, which is focused on tuberous sclerosis, which has a significant proportion of those individuals have epilepsy. They were also doing crowdsourcing to fund research. So these different innovative ideas are certainly in the environment. Sometimes it can be a little hard to get traction depending on how visible an organization is. But I think every nonprofit funders are open to creative ways to move the science forward.
Yeah, I see this as a way that organizations like ours are evolving very, very quickly. And, I spoke in my opening comments to family research funds. I'm not sure if I was still connected at that point, but, in many ways, that's a crowdfunding effort, right? It's one family basically leveraging their contacts, their network to try and raise as much money as possible to support a very specific research concept. And, being able to support that while also thinking about the greater good. How do we, serve the broader mitochondrial disease community? That can be a challenge, right? The interests of one versus the many. But I think that's what organizations like ours that are going to be successful going forward have to find, right? Novel ways to be able to reach both of those audiences. And crowdfunding can be a very effective way to raise money for a specific topic very quickly.
Great. Okay, Phil, here's a question for you. It's an easy one. What's the last date for grant submission for UMDF?
So the current cycle is now closed. So apologies to the person who submitted that. We've received our applications. They've undergone peer review. We're just in the final steps of kind of pulling together our logistics to make our announcements. The next planned grant cycle would not be until January of 2021. That being said, I did mention some other mechanisms we have for funding that might take place in the fall. We might have a targeted cycle in the fall for a specific form of mitochondrial disease. We might partner with other patient groups to do a joint grant cycle. So there's a number of things that are being looked at, but unfortunately for the current cycle, the deadline is already passed, and we won't be able to help.
Any other final parting thoughts that either of you have? I know.
I think my take-home message, and I've mentioned it in a few of the responses, is that think about incorporating that patient voice as early as possible into your research ideas, and that there's now a established pathway for gathering that kind of information from patient groups. So reach out, ask questions. We can help you to sharpen up those research ideas and bring the patient voice. And I think you can count on agencies like the NIH, the FDA, the DOD, a multitude of funding agencies to really receive that well, to know that you've approached the patient community early in the process.
Yeah, and I'll just echo that. That is so critical to have that patient voice reflected in the work. I think that's appreciated not just from nonprofit funders, but also through the ranks of different funding agencies, learning how to and building those networks with the different advocacy groups. There are many, many groups, and I think with the burgeoning of social media, people are able to find each other. People who are affected by a specific kind of disorder are able to find each other, rally, and support the researcher. So building those relationships is key. Demonstrating your understanding of that in grant proposals is also very important. And as Phil mentioned, we're always happy to help answer those questions or make connections. If anybody wants to reach out to me, my email address is laura.lubbers@cureepilepsy.org. And you can always come to our website and ask questions through our inboxes. We're always happy to engage and help researchers to move their science forward. What you do is critical. It's critical for the advances that are so desperately needed. My family has personally been positively impacted by the research that's happened in our community, and that's why I'm so excited to continue that work.
Great. Well, thank you so much to both of our presenters. That was really fantastic. You guys did a great job. As a final reminder, we're looking to hire a new program director in neurodevelopmental disabilities at NINDS. You can see the information here and either contact that email or you can contact me. Just as a reminder, this session was recorded. It will be transcribed and archived on the NINDS website in the coming week or so. And details about where to find the archived version will be posted on social media and professional society listservs and newsletters. So once again, thanks a million to both of our presenters. Thanks a million, Tim. Hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you.